The wind howled through the pines like a pack of starving wolves, rattling the shutters of Clara Boone's cabin. She stoked the fire, her sharp blue eyes flicking to the door every time the wind kicked up. The storm had rolled in at dusk, turning the world into a swirling white chaos. Clara had seen enough winters to know this one meant business. A knock at the door, sharp and urgent, cut through the gale. Clara set the poker down and reached for her revolver, tucking it into the waistband of her skirt before answering. She pulled the door open just enough to see two towering figures, their faces obscured by the brims of their weather-beaten hats. Snowflakes clung to their thick beards, and their breath steamed in the cold air. "We need shelter, ma'am," the taller one rumbled, his voice like distant thunder. "Our camp got buried in the slide." Clara eyed them, brothers by the look of them, built like grizzlies and just as wild. Their clothes were patched and worn, their rifles slung over their shoulders like extensions of their arms. Mountain men, through and through. She hesitated, but the code of the frontier was clear: turn no one away in a storm. "Fine," she said, stepping back. "But you sleep by the fire. I got a cell for troublemakers." The brothers exchanged a glance, then shuffled inside, shaking off the snow. The smaller one, his beard streaked with gray, nodded at her. "Much obliged. Name's Elias. This here's Caleb." Clara shut the door behind them and latched it. "Sheriff Boone. Rules are simple: no drinking, no fighting, and you touch my coffee pot, I'll shoot you." Caleb, the taller one, let out a low chuckle. "Ain't here for trouble, Sheriff. Just warmth." The night wore on. The fire crackled, casting long shadows on the walls as the wind screamed outside. Clara kept her revolver within reach, but the brothers seemed content to sit in silence, their massive hands wrapped around tin cups of coffee. Elias occasionally glanced at her, his gaze lingering a little too long, but Clara had dealt with worse. She couldn't help but notice the way they moved, economical, deliberate, like men who knew how to survive. Their presence filled the cabin, making it feel smaller, warmer. Clara found herself stealing glances at them, too, studying the way their beards glistened with melted snow, the way their eyes reflected the firelight. Then, just as the storm reached its peak, a gunshot rang out from the direction of town. Clara was on her feet in an instant, her hand on her revolver. "Stay here," she ordered, but the brothers were already standing, their own rifles in hand. "We ain't letting you go out there alone," Caleb said, his voice firm. Clara knew better than to argue. She grabbed her coat and hat, and the three of them stepped into the blinding snow, the wind tearing at their clothes like a living thing. The town was a ghostly outline in the storm, the buildings barely visible through the swirling white. Clara led the way, her revolver gripped tightly in her hand. The brothers followed close behind, their rifles ready. The gunshot had come from the saloon, its flickering lantern light barely visible through the snow. As they approached, Clara could hear raised voices inside, the sound muffled by the storm. She pushed the door open with her revolver, the barrel leading the way. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and the stench of whiskey. 3 men stood in the center of the room, their faces twisted in anger. One of them, a wiry trapper with a scar down his cheek, held a smoking pistol. At his feet lay the body of Old Man Higgins, the saloon keeper, his shirt stained red. "Evenin', boys," Clara said, her voice steady. "Drop the iron." The scarred man sneered. "Ain't your business, Sheriff. This old coot cheated me." Caleb stepped forward, his rifle leveled. "He's right. Ain't no call for murder." The trapper's eyes darted between them, his finger twitching on the trigger. "Who the hell are you?" "Men who don't take kindly to killin'," Elias growled. For a heartbeat, the room was still. Then the trapper lunged for his gun. Clara fired first. The shot echoed like thunder, and the trapper crumpled, clutching his shoulder. His companions froze, their hands raised. "Next one's between the eyes," Clara said, her voice cold. The fight went out of them. They dragged their wounded friend toward the door, disappearing into the storm. Silence settled over the saloon. Clara knelt beside Higgins, pressing her fingers to his neck. No pulse. She sighed and stood, her jaw tight. Elias placed a hand on her shoulder. You did what you had to. Clara shook her head. Don't make it easier. Caleb studied her, his dark eyes unreadable. Ain't about easy. It's about right. She looked at them, these two strangers who had backed her without hesitation. The storm still raged outside, but for the first time in years, Clara didn't feel alone. The storm had passed, but the cold lingered, biting at Clara Boone's cheeks as she stood over Old Man Higgins' fresh grave. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the snow-covered mountains in shades of pink and gold. Elias and Caleb stood beside her, their massive frames casting long shadows across the frozen earth. The silence between them was heavy, the kind that comes after violence, after decisions that can't be undone. Clara adjusted the brim of her hat, her breath misting in the frigid air. "Reckon I ought to wire the circuit judge," she said, her voice steady despite the weight in her chest. Higgins deserved better than a shallow grave and a quick prayer. Caleb shifted, his boots crunching in the snow. "Ain't no judge comin' up this mountain till spring, Sheriff. You know that." She did. The passes were still buried under feet of snow, and the circuit judge was a man who valued his comfort over his duty. Clara exhaled sharply, her gloved hands clenching into fists. "Then I'll see to it he don't get forgotten." Elias nodded, his gray-streaked beard catching the morning light. "We'll help. Least we can do." Clara looked at them, really looked at them, for the first time since they'd stumbled into her cabin. They were rough men, hardened by years in the wilderness, their faces lined with scars and sun. But there was something in their eyes, a steadiness she didn't often see in the drifters and outlaws who passed through Blackridge. She gave a curt nod. "Appreciate it." The walk back to town was quiet, the only sounds the creak of leather and the distant call of a raven. The streets were empty, most folks still huddled by their fires, waiting for the world to thaw. Clara led the way to the sheriff's office, a squat wooden building with a sagging porch. Inside, the stove was cold, the air thick with the scent of old paper and gun oil. She tossed a few logs into the stove and struck a match, the flames flickering to life with a crackle. Elias leaned against the wall, arms crossed over his chest. "You've been sheriff long?" "5 years," Clara said, brushing the snow from her coat. "Took over after my husband died in a shootout with the McCabe gang." Caleb's expression darkened. "Heard of 'em. Nasty bunch." "They're all nasty," Clara muttered, pouring coffee from the pot on the stove. She offered them each a cup, and they took it without a word. The warmth of the tin mug seeped into her fingers, a small comfort against the cold. Elias sipped his coffee, his gaze wandering over the wanted posters tacked to the wall. "You ever think about leavin'? Headin' someplace warmer?" Clara almost laughed. "And do what? I'm a sheriff. This is my life." "Ain't no life," Caleb said, his voice low. "Just a slow way of dyin'." She shot him a sharp look, but there was no malice in his words, just the hard truth of a man who'd seen too much. Clara turned away, staring into the flames of the stove. "Maybe so. But it's mine." A sudden pounding on the door made them all tense. Clara set her coffee down and reached for her revolver, but Elias was already moving, his rifle in hand. She nodded at him and pulled the door open, her gun trained on the figure outside. Deputy Rogers stood on the porch, his face pale, his hat clutched in his hands. "Sheriff, we got a problem. Riders just came into town. 6 of 'em, armed to the teeth. They're a skin for you by name." Clara's stomach twisted. "Who are they?" Rogers swallowed hard. "Didn't say. But they ain't friendly." She exchanged a glance with the brothers. Elias's jaw was set, his grip tight on his rifle. Caleb's eyes were dark, calculating. "You want us to come?" Caleb asked. Clara didn't hesitate. "I'd be a fool to say no." The 4 of them moved quickly, stepping out into the crisp morning air. The riders were gathered in front of the livery stable, their horses stamping in the snow. They were a rough-looking bunch, their coats dusted with snow, their faces hidden beneath the brims of their hats. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward as Clara approached. "You the sheriff?" he asked, his voice a low growl. I am, Clara said, her hand resting on the grip of her revolver. What's your business here? The man's lips curled into a smirk. Heard you got a pair of mountain men holed up with you. We're here to collect M. Beside her, Elias tensed. The hell you are, he said, his voice like gravel. The rider's smirk faded, his hand drifting toward his gun. This ain't your fight, old man. Caleb stepped forward, his rifle leveled at the rider's chest. Make it one. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The tension was thick enough to cut, the air crackling with the promise of violence. Then, with a suddenness that made Clara's heart leap, the rider lunged for his gun. Gunfire erupted. Clara's revolver roared, the kick familiar against her palm. Beside her, Elias and Caleb's rifles barked in unison, the sound echoing off the buildings. The riders scrambled for cover, their horses rearing in panic. Clara moved swiftly, her boots kicking up snow as she advanced, her gun spitting fire. One of the riders went down, clutching his leg. Another turned his horse and fled, the others following suit, their retreat as sudden as their arrival. Clara didn't lower her gun until they were out of sight, her breath coming in sharp gasps. Silence settled over the street, broken only by the distant sound of hooves fading into the distance. Clara turned to the brothers, her heart still pounding. You two got enemies I ought to know about? Elias holstered his rifle, his expression grim. More than our share. Caleb spat in the snow. They'll be back. Clara knew he was right. She looked at the two of them, these men who had stepped into her life like a storm, bringing chaos and something else, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Protection. Partnership. Then we'd best be ready, she said, her voice steady. You're with me now. At least, till this blows over. Elias met her gaze, his eyes unreadable. Reckon we are. Caleb nodded, a slow smile spreading across his face. Reckon we are. The sun hung low over Blackridge, casting long shadows across the snow-dusted streets. Clara Boone stood on the porch of the sheriff's office, her arms crossed, her breath curling in the cold air. Inside, Elias and Caleb sat at the desk, cleaning their rifles with the methodical precision of men who had done it 1,000 times before. The tension from the earlier shootout still hummed in the air, thick and unspoken. Clara had sent Deputy Rogers to ride out to the nearby ranches, warning them to keep an eye out for strangers. She didn't know who those riders were, but she knew trouble when she saw it. And trouble had a way of sticking around. She pushed open the door and stepped inside, the warmth of the stove wrapping around her like a blanket. We need to talk, she said, pulling up a chair and sitting across from the brothers. Those men weren't just passing through. They knew your names. They came for you. Elias didn't look up from his rifle. We've got a history. One that follows you, Clara pressed. I need to know what I'm dealing with. Caleb set his rifle down and leaned back in his chair, his dark eyes meeting hers. We were trappers up north, workin' the Yukon. Got tangled up with a gang Callan, themselves the Iron Ridge Boys. They run guns, whiskey, and women, and they don't take kindly to folks who don't play by their rules. Clara's stomach tightened. And you didn't play by their rules. We don't take kindly to slavers, Elias said, his voice low and dangerous. Found out they were sellin' women to the mines up in Dawson. We put a stop to it. Clara exhaled sharply. So now they're hunting you. Caleb nodded. And they won't stop till we're dead or they are. She stood abruptly, pacing the small office. So you brought this to my town. Elias's gaze snapped up, his eyes flashing. We didn't ask for your help, Sheriff. We didn't even know you existed till last night. But we sure as hell ain't gonna let you face this alone. Clara stopped, her hands on her hips. She looked at them, these two men who had walked into her life like a storm, bringing danger and something else, something she hadn't let herself feel in years. Trust. Reliance. Maybe even a flicker of hope. She sat back down, her voice softer. All right. Then we do this together. But we do it smart. No more shootouts in the street. We end this before it ends us. Caleb grinned, slow and dangerous. Now you're talking. The next morning, Clara rode out with the brothers, following the tracks left by the Iron Ridge boys. The snow had stopped, but the cold bit deep, the air sharp enough to make her lungs ache. They moved quietly, their horses picking their way through the trees, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. Elias rode slightly ahead, his rifle resting across his saddle. They'll have set up camp somewhere close. They're not the type to ride far when they've got a score to settle. Clara nodded, her hand resting on the grip of her revolver. We find them, we end this. No warnings. No second chances. Caleb chuckled darkly. You're startin' to sound like us, Sheriff. She didn't answer, her focus sharp as they crested a ridge and looked down into the valley below. Smoke curled from a cluster of tents nestled among the trees, the flicker of a campfire visible even in the daylight. Clara's stomach twisted. There were more of them than she'd expected. At least a dozen men, their horses tethered nearby, their rifles leaning against logs. Elias dismounted, his movements silent as he tied his horse to a tree. We go in quiet. Take 'em by surprise. Clara swung down from her saddle, her boots sinking into the snow. No mistakes. Caleb checked his rifle, his expression grim. No mistakes. They moved like shadows, slipping through the trees, the cold air sharp in their lungs. Clara could hear the low murmur of voices from the camp, the occasional burst of laughter. Her pulse pounded in her ears, but her hands were steady, her focus unwavering. Elias signaled for them to stop, crouching low behind a cluster of boulders. The camp was just below them, the men gathered around the fire, their faces flushed with drink. Clara counted them, 12, just as she'd thought. Too many for a fair fight, but she'd never been one to care much about fair. Caleb leaned in close, his voice barely a whisper. We take out the leader first. That's the scarred one, name's Harlan. Rest'll scatter like roaches. Clara nodded, her fingers tightening around her revolver. On my mark. Elias and Caleb readied their rifles, their eyes locked on the camp below. Clara took a deep breath, her gaze fixed on Harlan, the man who had brought this storm down on them. Then she stood. Her first shot rang out, echoing through the valley like thunder. Harlan dropped before he could even reach for his gun, his body crumpling into the snow. Chaos erupted in the camp, men scrambling for their weapons, shouting in panic. Clara didn't hesitate. She fired again, her revolver kicking in her hand, the shots precise and deadly. Beside her, Elias and Caleb's rifles roared, their bullets finding their marks with brutal efficiency. The camp dissolved into madness, men running for cover, their shouts filling the air. It was over in minutes. Clara stood in the center of the camp, her revolver still smoking, her breath coming in sharp gasps. The snow around her was stained red, the bodies of the Iron Ridge boys scattered like broken dolls. Elias and Caleb moved among them, checking for survivors, their faces grim. Caleb looked up at her, his eyes dark. It's done. Clara holstered her revolver, her hands trembling slightly. Yeah, it's done. Elias stepped closer, his voice low. You all right, Sheriff? She met his gaze, her heart pounding. I am now. Caleb grinned, clapping her on the shoulder. Reckon we make a pretty good team. Clara looked at the two of them, these men who had walked into her life like a storm and left it forever changed. She smiled, slow and sure. Reckon we do. As they mounted their horses and rode back toward Blackridge, the sun broke through the clouds, casting the mountains in golden light. The storm was over. And for the first time in a long time, Clara Boone felt something she hadn't in years: peace.